Today we've got Evonnia Woods here from ReproAction, which is a new reproductive health organization in the country. It is a national organization. And so she is the Missouri field organizer. She lives here in Columbia. She is a PhD candidate. I think she will be conferred that PhD maybe this spring. But she and I connected because I do a lot of stuff with Planned Parenthood and with, I sit on the board for the Missouri Family Health Council, which is Title 10. And we started talking about maternal fetal mortality rates. So the U.S. has the worst maternal and infant mortality rates of all developed nations. And the maternal and infant mortality rates are extremely telling when we talk about the health of our nation. And when assessed by race, particularly Black women in Missouri on average are 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy-related complications, regardless of wealth and education. Makes me really glad that when I was in Kansas City, I just stepped across the state line and had my first kid in Kansas instead of Missouri. But on average, Black babies are twice as likely to die within their first year of life. And these rates in Missouri are on par with the national average. So, all of these deaths are preventable. So we're going to let Evonnia tell us about what she does in Missouri for this particular issue and some other issues.
All right. I'm Evonnia Woods. I'm the state organizer for ReproAction. Like she said, it's a national organization. We're a direct action reproductive justice organization. We work on abortion, access to contraception, and holding the left accountable. We're like a radical, we're a radical organization, very progressive on that end of things. And we're not afraid to hold the left accountable. We identify as a left flank organization. So in situations, for instance, we'll just go ahead and get into this and then leave it. Like we hit it with our car, it was a hit and run situation. For instance, when you have Democratic leaders announcing that they'll take pro-life Democrats. We're like heavily opposed to that. So keep that in mind moving forward. And we're going to leave it and keep going. All right. And we also, with being reproductive justice, it's implied that we are intersectional. Our work is intersectional. And that has become a buzzword. Intersectionality as a concept has become a buzzword. Not everyone understands it who uses it. But in this way, reproductive justice is a concept, a tool in movement work. It's rooted in Black women primarily, but women of color in general, a philosophy that was generated by women of color, to essentially say, like, not only are issues intersectional, but the most marginalized people who are affected by an issue needs to be centered. We need to be, the most marginalized people need to be in leadership positions. They need to be consulted. They need to be the people in charge, leading the work in whatever they're the ones who are mostly affected by any situation. And so reproductive justice is a useful concept where the work pretty much came out of women of color being involved in political and social justice work and realizing that their concerns were not being placed at the forefront of the work, right? And so you had situations, and you all will know this, especially if you've been active over a long period of time. I've mostly read about this, but even in my short span of activism, where politics or games and social justice issues are treated like a zero-sum game, right? Where everyone feels as if they're selling each other out, right? Where it's like, hey, we'll give you labor rights if you don't back this LGBTQ campaign and this work, and it continues to divide, and we continue to be conquered in that way. And so with reproductive justice, the idea is realizing that not only is access to contraception, first of all, it's realizing that reproductive health is more than just abortion. Though we are centered, like advocating explicitly for abortion, realizing that it's not just about abortion. Police brutality is a reproductive justice issue. Having clean water is a reproductive justice issue, right? Having access to affordable insurance and healthcare, all of those things that we can assume and take for granted as being reproductive health issues, outside of that is included in the reproductive justice framework. So there's more going on here. LGBTQ rights are reproductive justice issues, right? And we incorporate trans women into that fold of being a part of our movement to gain equality. So it's one of those where it's complex. It's not something very simple, and we have to be thinking about how we have to be thinking intersectionally at all times, essentially, right? Okay, and so the direct action component of the organization is not simply just protesting in the way that we're holding signs. We do that too, and I love it. And I'm sure if you haven't seen me, you will. But also, in our 501c3 status, we don't lobby at all, so you won't catch me at the Capitol talking to politicians, but you can catch me at the Capitol doing other things. We're issue focused, right? So we don't advocate for bills in particular. Though some of my work is figuring out how to work with organizations who lobby, right? So again, talking about how issues come back into the fold of being reproductive justice, we currently have this situation with DACA and the Dream Act Coalition, or the Dream Coalition. They're fighting for a Clean Dream Act. And they're fighting for a Clean Dream Act, which is lobbying, which we cannot do. But in figuring out how ReproAction can help with that, it's in recognizing that immigration is a reproductive justice issue, right? And so how can we help? Well, we can help raise awareness. We can help educate around immigration and how that's a reproductive justice issue, and that's how we're able to fold into that work, right? So thinking about that, it's complex, it's complicated, where we don't have this narrow lens of what activism can look like. It's expanding it and helping people see how these things are intersectional. So currently in Missouri right now, working on 2 campaigns. We have national campaigns, a national campaign being our anti-CPC campaign. CPCs are crisis pregnancy centers. We have one here in Columbia, the My Life Clinic, which is across and the street from the Planned Parenthood here, which is usually how they place themselves. If they're not buying, having actual clinics like Planned Parenthood close and physically buying up those spaces and putting their clinics in those spaces, they put them close by in the same buildings or across the street or next door. And they have names like My Life Clinic. And we associate clinic with being a health clinic, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a health clinic, and legally that's how they get away with that. In addition to that, these CPCs tie into funding at a state level. They're a part of the anti-abortion movement's response to abortion providers. So it's how the protesters that you see in front of Planned Parenthood here are associated with the Crisis Pregnancy Center. Their objective is to deter women from going into Planned Parenthood and getting them across the street to their Crisis Pregnancy Center. Now, the crisis pregnancy centers here in Missouri, we have about 71 or 72 crisis pregnancy centers in the state, okay? They're funded by our tax dollars. They get funded through tax credits, and they also get funded from TANF funds, which are block grants from the federal government that come into the state that are supposed to go to feeding hungry pregnant women and their children, or newly found moms, like the children once they're born, right? And so I think their budget went up to like $6 point something million, but in 2017, They got about 5.7 million of our tax dollars here in the state to go to these fake anti-abortion clinics. They are also unlicensed facilities. They're unregulated. They do not have to report what they do inside of these clinics. And if you keep in mind that per recent legislation, clinics, healthcare facilities have to, like Planned Parenthood, have to lie to their patients about the process of pregnancy, how that whole thing works, and also they have to make their patients aware that they could go to a CPC as an option for their care. But these CPCs do not provide care. They're not to focus on the fact that there are no licensed physicians in there, but there are none. Is this what we're doing? Okay.
Say, CPCs are not health clinics.
They are not.
They are not required by law. They are not regulated like a health clinic, so they are not health clinics at all. Also, your HIPAA information, if you go in there and you give them medical information, they do not have to abide by HIPAA because they are not health care facilities. So they can do with your medical information what they would like.
Not that there's any medical information to provide, right? So at best, if you go on their websites or if you go into the facility, there may be people walking around in lab coats, looking official, giving you the feel that it's official, but at best what you could do is get an ultrasound reading from someone who doesn't even meet the state or federal requirements for people who have that job at actual hospitals or actual healthcare clinics. So they're getting millions of our tax dollars to do nothing. Their goal is to deter women from having abortion. At a direct action I did last summer under the hashtag Expose Fake Clinics, I was on the news at about noon or so, and the news people went and asked the clinic. So they were alerted to the fact that we were going to be out there later. They gathered up some protesters to come outside. Now, the focus of that action was, like I said, our work is intersectional, tying it into our second campaign on maternal and infant mortality. All of their protesters showed up with anti-abortion signs. But our focus for that action was on maternal and infant mortality and how crisis pregnancy centers do nothing to address that. Again, like if you're not connecting this, they weren't out there. We were out there protesting how they did nothing about maternal and infant mortality. All of our signs were about maternal and infant mortality. All of our chats were about maternal and infant mortality. But they were out there with anti-abortion signs, you know, showing them pictures of their fetuses and talking about how abortion is bad. And I'm like, that is not even why we're here. So that gives you, you know, the visual component of that symbolism is very strong because their sole purpose is to deter women from abortion. It's not any other purpose. And if you go online and you do some research, or if you hit me up, I can send you some links of organizations that have gone inside to see what they do, because them being unregulated and not actually being a clinic and not having to report what they do, you have to run operations to see what they do. And what people have found is that they lie to patients about how far along they are in their pregnancy, just to get them to, like, if you're in your state, you can't be further along than 22 weeks, they'll tell you that you're 22 weeks, right? But you may be only 12 or 13 or 14 weeks or something like that. Okay, so there's that with the crisis pregnancy centers, right? And so this maternal and infant mortality campaign, like Shaman told you before I came up here, these rates are abysmal. Most of these deaths are preventable. So globally, as the global rate, it's been decreasing. The rate here in the US has been going up. 2015, they had a good year, so, you know, all of the people who usually get shamed for these rates, they started publishing all these stories like, the rate's decreasing. It was an off year. It's back. It's going back on the incline. On average, here in the United States, she gave you the racial disparity rates of Black women and how Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die than white women from pregnancy complications. Black babies are twice as likely to die than white babies within their first year of life. But what you need to know is that that's on the racial disparity component, right? Even if we looked at white women, we would still be ranked last of all developed nations on maternal and infant mortality. Meanwhile, the United States outspends every other country in the world on healthcare per capita by billions. A substantial amount, right? And that substantial amount is even better reflected in the fact that maternal and infant mortality are the canary in the coal mine for knowing how well a country is doing. Looking at the livelihood of the country, if you can look at maternal and infant mortality rates, you can determine how well that country is doing. We're doing very bad, like super poorly, to the point where, again, tying these two campaigns together and looking at this, the World Health Organization, if you go to their website, you look up maternal mortality and look up their suggestions for what you should do, we're not doing any of them. We're doing the opposite of every single one. Affordable insurance, access to quality health care, funding facilities, preventable health care for mothers, perinatal care, right? So if you don't know, that's before she is pregnant. Like once she decides, I want to have a baby, all the way through to postpartum care. It usually goes up to a year, but it could go up to 5, depending on how that definition works for you. We don't do any of that very well, right? Making sure that your work is culturally sensitive, right? So we have those racial health disparities because a lot of the caretakers in the healthcare field, just like with everything in the United States, with the way that we, racism is drilled into us and becomes a part of our psyche in ways that we don't necessarily tend to, it affects the health care that women of color receive on a regular basis. It also, the way that it affects white women in the care that poor white women receive. Because we have these classist ideologies about how women know our own bodies and what we're going through and what we feel, right? So we have instances where doctors, not only is this something that like they could be unaware of, but there are instances where they're like literally taught this in their training. And I'll specifically give this as an example in how there's this belief that black women can endure more pain than white women can endure. So they're not receiving the painkillers post-birth for things like if you rip and tear, if you need to be sewn up, they're not giving them either any meds or the proper dosage of medicine to avoid the pain from that. Or also tending to things like hypertension, high blood pressure, and all of that. And since we live in the United States and we like to focus on individual solutions for problems, a lot of the literature will only look at what women aren't doing to help the situation, right? Instead of, this is a structural, systemic issue, it's institutionalized, it's in these institutions. They're not structured in a way that promotes healthy interactions with clients. They're not structured in a way to where they can center the voices of women, where they can actually listen to their clients and take time, right? We've all been to the doctor, and you get to the doctor and it's rushed. After waiting forever, first, like you may have to wait like an hour to get in, then you get in, and then they're like, okay, tell me your symptoms, and this sounds like this, I'm writing a prescription, and you're out the door, but they haven't the capacity to even talk with you and really get, in, unless you have a good doctor, because there, are exceptions. Okay. And so along with going back to like how these crisis pregnancy centers and maternal and infant mortality, here in Missouri, the Boot Heel region, which is southeast Missouri, and St. Louis have the worst rates for infant mortality. And it's up to like 5 times the racial disparity. So what I'm looking at within this campaign now is how to close the rural healthcare gap. That's a part of this as well. And when I tell you about, there are individual issues, for instance, that feed into the racial health disparity because word travels fast. And if you are a woman of color and you expect to be treated unfairly when you go to the physician, then they opt not to go. right? There are those issues individually when women are making these decisions, but it's rooted in reality. There's also issues on a structural level, again, that are having a larger effect than these individual women making these choices. For instance, transportation issues, cost issues, geographical issues. We've had 6 hospital closings in the state of Missouri. 6, right? These hospital closings have been in areas that have left pregnant women in a situation where they're having to travel an hour or 2 to get to a facility that can even begin to work on the issues that they have. All right, which is problematic. I grew up in Southern Illinois, not Missouri, but where I grew up, small village, population 300, and you had to travel 45 minutes, highway miles, like 45 minutes. That's no traffic, nothing holding you up. It'll take you 45 minutes to get to a hospital where they had a facility for you to deliver your baby and had a nursery for the baby, 45 minutes. So if you are pregnant and you have a complication that you need fast care for, there is none available within close range that could really give you the assistance that you need. So this is a real issue for so many women. Okay, this is important, right? So what is ReproAction doing to counter these issues, right? So right now, of course, direct action protests, expose fake clinics if you have a Twitter, which you might. Hashtag expose fake clinics. A lot of our protests are there. And it's organizations, it's a national network of organizations working to raise awareness and bring attention to crisis pregnancy centers, where ReproAction differs a little bit in that, is that we're exposing these fake clinics, but we're tying it into how they do nothing to address maternal and infant mortality. We feel like maternal and infant mortality is something that people should be able to get behind regardless of political divides, right? You want pregnant women to have healthy babies, you want the babies to live. That should not be a political issue. So there's direct action protests. You could get on our emailing list, keep you posted. You could always come out with me. I don't protest in the cold, so you don't have to worry about that. Also, what I'm doing this spring, we have maternal and infant mortality screenings. There's a screening event where we show a documentary that emphasizes that racial health disparity of Black women being 3 to 4 times more likely to die than white women. And there's a panel afterwards where we talk about that. I already had the one here in Columbia last August, but there's one in Jefferson City next Saturday. It's at Capitol. We're doing that. Okay.
Put some context on that. We were 32nd in infant mortality in 1980.
Right. So over the last 30 years with all of these regressive policies, we've just been getting worse and worse, like exponentially. Like I said, other countries in the world, they're taking steps to address their issues, but we're regressing in a way that we're worse now than we ever were. And with all the technology out in the world, it shouldn't be this bad. Like I said, most of the deaths are preventable. And by preventable, I mean if we were doing the screenings, if people had access to affordable education, if they could make it to the facilities, right? Like these are all things that can be addressed, that can be done. But the first thing on the cutting board is usually healthcare. Right, social programs that actually help pregnant women and children are constantly being cut. So you think about those TANF funds are supposed to go to feeding hungry babies, right? But they're going to crisis pregnancy centers. So how does that takes away from maternal and infant mortality? That takes away from being able to address it. If one of the ways the government set forth to address it was to give money to feed hungry children, and then you take that and you give it to an anti-abortion clinic. It feeds, further into this narrative. I don't feel like I have to tell y'all this, but they only care about you when you're in your belly, right? Like the fetus, we're pro-fetus, but pro-life not so much, because once the child is born, we're taking money. They don't have to eat. We don't have to feed them. Then we have these conversations about black and white. Okay. So anywho, are there any questions or anything that someone wants me to follow up on or emphasize or know more about?
Yeah, well, you did use one word that I would hope you wouldn't use in the future. You talked about the people who are pro-life. And as your speech told us, they aren't pro-life.
Exactly.
They're anti-abortion. So I would avoid that word altogether. Because you're making them pro something good, and they're not.
Oh, well, I like to use pro-life because they gifted. I consider that term a gift. Because from that, we can pivot and say, again, you're not pro-life, right? I can't berate them for not being pro-life if they don't identify as pro-life.
Yeah, well, at least say we are pro-life.
We are, but with words you have like the dictionary meaning, and then you have the context that they've created, the connotations that they've created around that term. And so I like to feed off of that. I get good blog posts out of berating them for saying that they're pro-life.
Well, maybe say so-called pro-life, and that could just emphasize a little more. But I was curious, when did all this start falling apart in the United States? And was this just different laws that were presented for racial reasons, for anti-abortion reasons, and to know how we got to as bad as we are?
Yeah, well, again, it's all intersectional, right? Race is tied in to everything. If you think about the location of where these CPCs tend to be, they tend to put themselves where women of color and poor women are located geographically. If you think about Planned Parenthood and the people who they serve, they tend to serve poor people and women of color disproportionately, right? And these CPCs locate themselves close to those communities. And so when you look at this, you don't see the anti-abortion movement harassing abortion providers who provide abortions to wealthy white women. You don't see it. You see them harassing abortion providers who provide abortions to poor people, and how they've drawn. Then you can also draw a contingency on how they have tied into this Black Lives Matter movement, and they're like, oh, well, we're Black Lives because look at all these Black people who have killed their babies, and how can you be Black Lives Matter and then promote Black genocide? And it provides very vivid images. But it also negates the fact that women, the structural reasons, again, of why women decide to get abortions, right? And a lot of it is financial. A lot of it is structurally implicated that it's outside. You are making a decision that's best for you and your family and the life that you want to live. We know that the most telling factor in a woman's livelihood is economics. Her ability to economically provide for herself, and we know that having children prevents you from doing that. We would like to make that situation better where you're not deciding if and when you have a kid to be that big of a factor, but our current standard of living, or the way that the structures around us operate, we don't get maternity leave. We don't even get equality in wages, right? Having a kid, you can't. How many women have had children and lost jobs because the child gets sick? You get penalized for having children and working. You can't do both. Child care is astronomical. So many reasons. But, for whatever reason, there's not as much attention from the anti-abortion movement paid to these structural inequalities that women face. But if you look back historically, all the way back to the eugenics movement, even back to slavery, I can go on and on, but particularly the eugenics movement, outside of slavery, in population control, right? And that's also a factor that I feel like we've gotten down a little bit. Let's perk it back up.
I have two thoughts. One question is, how did you determine that the money that was supposed to go to WIC was going to these organizations that are the anti-abortion organizations?
How do we know they're getting TANF funds?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking?
You said, all this money.
How do we know? It's in the budget.
Thousands of dollars is going.
It's millions, and it's in the budget. So last year, when your governor cut care for seniors and people with disabilities, he gave CPCs an increase. It's outlined in the budget. It's not hiding.
What do they call it?
They just use money they use TANF funds.
Yeah, so,
They use TANF funds, which are block grants from, what is it, what's the acronym stand for?
temporary assistance for needy families.
Yeah, temporary assistance for needy families. So the federal government gives us a block grant.
They can do
And
anything they
then
want.
with that block grant, instead of because now it's a block grant instead of directed funding, MOLED, and because it's we have a super majority of Republicans, they have decided that they will take money from the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Fund, and they directly give $5 million this year, it's $6 million, to crisis pregnancy centers. They are not required. The crisis pregnancy centers are not required to do any kind of reporting. So they're essentially given money, and then they are not required to tell MOLED what they are doing with that money, how they spend that money, and it doesn't matter if they use it for assistance for
going
needy
back,
families.
you're talking about the budget. What about previous years of other
They also-
governors?
No. This has been going on for years. This is years that we've had TANF funding.
Yeah,
This is not just
this
the
is,
governor.
this is something that goes way, way back. When first they started giving money here to all the states for family planning, Missouri did something very smart. They set up this separate organization so that the state legislature couldn't mess with it. Well, over the years, that's eroded. And now the state legislature messes with it. And they can get away with it because there's no real monitoring of block grant money.
Well, and there's no crisis pregnancy. The legislature does not require crisis pregnancy centers to report back on any money that they're given. And because they're not a health clinic, they have no other governing body that sees what that can walk in and see what they do, because they're not real clinics, even though they're called clinics. So they're using money that is supposed to go to food stamps and all of those things, and they get not only that, but they get tax credits. If you give money to a crisis pregnancy center, you can get a tax credit, and then they get a benefit from having that also. And so it's and no other charity gets that in the state. No other charity gets that benefit.
Oh my.
And so they are given, and that is because we have, and that is because we have a legislature that is overarchingly anti-choice.
Where is one of those in Columbia?
Right across the street from Planned Parenthood. My Life Clinic.
Right.
Just outside of we only have one, but there's like 71 or 72 in the state.
Yeah.
Who receive this money. And I also want to emphasize about the funding portion is that they're largely volunteer driven.
Right, so what are they doing?
What are they doing with it? The only thing that they're doing when you go, you get free diapers, cheap diapers. Like the no brand name, you don't find these diapers in Target. Like you get cheap diapers, and it's largely volunteer driven. So this money isn't going to pay staff. Like there are questions, we have questions, but they don't have to answer them because they're unregulated. Like that is literally what unregulated means. Like they do not have to report by law, or they don't have to write up anything. They don't have to tell us where any of these millions of dollars are going.
But there is a bill that is in hearing for Missouri. It's in health and mental health. It's in that committee to require the CPCs to report on how they spend their money. It is not a bill that is asking for them to have to refer back to the abortion clinics or to do anything differently than they're doing. It just requires that they report back to the Missouri legislature what they're doing with the money.
Who's sponsoring it?
And I can't.
Democrat or Republican?
No, it's a Democrat. It's a Democrat. It's a Democrat. But I don't. The bills are in my car. I was thinking about it as you were in here that I should just go out there and get them. But there's so you can call and you can say, I would just like these people to have to tell us what they're doing with the $6 million we're giving them.
Are they a C3? Do they have any
No.
kind of federal status at all?
Well, yeah, they're
Because you know,
religious
everyone's-
organizations. they are religious organizations, so they are not like, so they don't have, they are all connected to a church of some kind, and they are all religious organizations. And the bill, and I can't remember the bill, but the bill actually calls them religious crisis pregnancy because that's what they are, and that's why they have also no oversight.
I was also wondering if you looked into the issue of women in prison having babies. I've read awful stories about that, how they're constrained and.
Yeah. So actually, the ACLU's leading that work right now. Maternal shackling is what it's called.
Yeah.
And they are pushing for ACLU. This is not ReproAction lobbying, but I can just inform you that the ACLU, they do lobby, and they're lobbying for a bill that they have at the State House.
I think.
So, and that bill is SB 803. That's what the Senate bill is, and that's sponsored by Jamila Rashid, maybe. It's a Democrat, and then but on the House side, it is bill, I think it's 1624.
You can always find it on a title too.
But it is sponsored by a Republican. So there's an anti-shackling bill that are being presented on both sides. It seems to have bipartisan support, and when you speak to people, they seem to be against it. But this is the third session that this bill has been introduced. That these bills have been introduced, and they still haven't passed. So, and they are not even large bills. They are just for third trimester shackling and labor and delivery shackling, and they have exceptions to the rule. So, but we still allow 4-point. We still allow 4-point shackling, which is arms, legs like this, face down for pregnant women through the third trimester. Yes, in Missouri.
That is torture.
So these are all things you can call your state legislator about.
All right, so it was co-founded by Erin Matson, who's in the DC area, and Pamela Mayer, who's in the St. Louis area. They both linked up, just noticing that there was this gap in reproductive health advocacy, that there was this gap, and that gap was in direct action, right? So you have these marches for life, 40 days for life, their direct action advocacy, the way that they stand out and protest in front of Planned Parenthood, the visibility that they have makes us think that there's more of them than they are. When in actuality, in the United States, most people are not anti-abortion. I know it's a double negative, work with me. Not that we're in favor, but most people are either pro-choice or pro-abortion, right? Not to think that pro-abortion is this bad label to have. I'm pro-abortion. Because they are also taking the language of pro-choice now, where they're calling themselves pro-choice. They feel like women should have the right to choose not to get an abortion. Where our pro-choice definition is that women should have the ability to choose whether, they're like taking it, owning it. You know, they took, our pro-woman language, our feminist language, and now they're co-opting the language of pro-choice.